Hello, welcome to our first chapter discussion for To Kill a Mockingbird. I really wish we were together for this, but we're going to make the best of the situation, and I'm going to be providing you with chapter by chapter discussions of what really is a timeless classic, a beautiful and provocative novel that really addresses some adult themes that I think are going to make you eager to talk about it. And I'm sad that we're not together for this, but maybe this will be a fair substitute for our personal conversations. Again, I hope that we might be doing some Zoom classroom setups, but for now, we'll start with discussion of chapter 1. And I'm going to be reading along in your edition, and at times I will refer to pages and areas on the page so that perhaps you are reading along with me. So let's get started. I do want to mention, and I think this is worth noting, we've talked about exposition. You may have at one time thought of that as the introduction. The exposition really serves 3 functions, in my opinion. Clearly, the exposition is where the setting is described. We learn the time and the place, the when and the where. So setting is often one of the earliest revelations provided in the exposition. We also meet characters. We're going to meet our narrator. She is Jean Louise Finch, and she is affectionately known as Scout. And you meet her in the very beginning because she is our first-person narrator. You'll meet other characters early in the novel, but obviously this is a very lengthy text. And so clearly we're not going to meet everyone at the beginning, but those really pivotal, those really primary characters are going to be introduced early on. Finally, the exposition also does something, I think, in terms of really providing us with a more complete background of the story and its place in the community. So the background perhaps may be how the depression is impacting families. Families like Mr. Cunningham, you're going to meet him early. And so when we think about not only the setting, how the setting influences the characters, and that to me is the background, the mood of the story. Obviously, if there is a depression, perhaps the mood might be a little more somber because families are struggling. I will tell you, fortunately, there is a lot of good humor and many fun scenes to be found in Mockingbird. But the opening chapter can be a challenge because we are getting some historical background into the family of Scout Finch. So let's just dive right in, okay? I'm on page 3 in your text, the opening page. And the start of a novel is often important, and I think that's true here because it really has the ability to draw us in and to hook us and to make us want to learn and read more. So Harper Lee begins Mockingbird by writing, "When he was nearly 13, my brother Jim got his arm badly broken at the elbow." That's curious. Why would you start with this tale of an injury without telling how the injury occurs? You're going to find out at the very end of the novel. You will find out what caused Jim to break his elbow. But right now, I want to know. Second paragraph. When enough years had gone by to enable us to look back on them, we sometimes discussed the events leading to his accident. I maintained that the Ewells started it all, but Jim, who was 4 years my senior, that means 4 years older, 4 years my senior said it started long before that. He said it began the summer Dill came to us. When Dill first gave us the idea of making Boo Radley come out. It's a curious name, Boo. Okay, it sounds like a nickname, and I will tell you it is. Arthur Radley is the gentleman that is known not so affectionately as Boo. So just in this one paragraph, we're introduced to the Ewells, a very key family, certainly when we get into part 2 of the novel. The Ewells, Dill, and Boo. Okay, now I'm going to tell you Dill is a minor character, and we're going to talk a little bit more about him here in just a minute. But in that one paragraph, in the second paragraph of the novel, we have met Scout, our narrator. We have met her older brother, Jim. We've been introduced to the Ewells, to Dill, and Boo. A lot of things are happening all at once. At this point, Scout goes into a bit of a historical description of her family and their long-standing status in the community. She talks about Finch's Landing. Now, the story is set in Macomb, Alabama. And Finch's Landing is just a community outside of Macomb, and it was where the Finch family originated, where they all lived until the point that Atticus studies law and moves to Macomb to become a lawyer. His younger brother also leaves and goes to Boston to practice medicine. So we go through this sort of historical family description. We learn a little bit about Atticus's law practice. And as we move to page 6, this is where the narrative, I feel, sort of takes off. Macomb was an old town, but it was a tired old town when I first knew it. So we're starting to learn a little bit about Macomb, and I told you that that's part of the function of exposition. So the town and its people are described. There was no hurry, for there was nowhere to go, nothing to buy, and no money to buy it with, nothing to see outside the boundaries of Macomb County. So we've got a sense of what Macomb is like, and that understanding will grow as the novel progresses. Scout mentions that she, her brother Jim, and Atticus also have a cook in their household. Now, Calpurnia doesn't live with them. Calpurnia is the cook. Calpurnia is a minor character, but again, she gives us great insight into our other characters. And again, we'll learn more about her. This is just the beginning. At the bottom of page 6, Scout says, Jim and I found our father satisfactory. Jim and I found our father satisfactory. He played with us, read to us, and treated us with courteous detachment. He was polite to us. Now, I just find that very intriguing, because if I were describing my mom and dad to you, I probably wouldn't have said they were satisfactory, although they were. I may have described things that my parents did with me, but I would have mentioned loving them. I would have perhaps mentioned having fun with them. I would have perhaps mentioned how they cared for me. I don't think I would have said that I found them satisfactory. I wonder why Scout describes her father that way. She goes on and at this point talks about Calpurnia. Now, I do want to mention, and I've said this to you earlier, this is a very sophisticated novel in terms of themes that are addressed. And I'm expecting you to read this with maturity and sensitivity and kindness. As you've been studying about Mockingbird as a banned book, you know that the language is one of the biggest reasons for that censorship. And we're going to need to be adults here. And I'm going to just address this head on early on so that we can move on. This story is set during the 1930s, long before the civil rights movement, which would show and recognize equality to people of other races. I have talked to individuals who were alive during this time. I've talked to African Americans who describe their lives and describe their treatment, and it was often unkind. At times it was brutal. And we know that there is a word that we today, and I certainly, as someone who has many friends who are African American, I find this word incredibly offensive. But the word nigger is in this book, and it is in this book often. You're going to hear Calpurnia herself, a Black woman, use this word. You're going to hear Scout, a small child, repeat this word when she hears countless others use it. You're going to hear this word as it is spewed from the mouth of a vile, dangerous, reprehensible man named Bob Ewell. And we want to think about the effect of that word as it is uttered by this diverse group of characters. But here at the top of page 7, we're told that Calpurnia wins epic battles against Scout because Atticus always took Calpurnia's side. Now, at this point, if you've read, you know why Calpurnia is so important to Atticus. For those of you who haven't, you might be curious. Where's Scout and Jim's mom? Where is she? Page 7. Our mother died when I was 2, so I never felt her absence. Jim was the product of their first year of marriage. 4 years later, I was born, and 2 years later, our mother died from a sudden heart attack. So if Scout was 2 when their mother died, that made Jim 4. Scout says, I did not miss her because Scout did not know her. But Jim did. I think Jim did. He remembered her clearly. And sometimes in the middle of a game, he would sigh at length, then go off and play by himself behind our car house. And he was like that. I knew better than to bother him. So even as a child, Scout sensed that Jim missed the presence of their mother. We learn at the bottom of page 7 that Scout and Jim had certain boundaries, calling distance. So when Calpurnia called for them, the expectation is that they were no further than Miss DuBose's, Miss Henry Lafayette DuBose, whom Scout describes as plain hell. Now, if you've got younger brothers or sisters, maybe you yourself have been told stories where you would repeat a curse word that you heard someone uttered. Scout's at that age. She's 6 years old, and she's kind of using some of this colorful language that while not appropriate, she really doesn't know the significance of these words. Miss DuBose's home was one boundary, and the Radley place was the other. And at the bottom of page 7, it says the Radley place was inhabited by an unknown entity, the mere description of whom was enough to make us all behave for days on end. So someone lives at the Radley place that is all it takes to get Scout and Jim to behave. One line that follows, that was the summer Dill came to us. Now, Dill, Charles Baker Harris, as he is named on page 8, Dill is a minor character. He doesn't play a significant role in the novel, but the role he plays, I think, is worth exploring. Despite the loss of their mother at a young age, I would suggest that Jim and Scout have a pretty idyllic childhood. Their father is a professional who earns a living that can keep them well cared for. While they don't have a mother, they do have Calpurnia, and she serves that role and functions as a mother just fine and has the support and the respect of Atticus. So Jim and Scout, I think they represent perhaps the best of childhood at that time. And Dill Dill's another story. Dill comes from a single mother, and later Dill is going to suggest that he just gets in the way, that his mother would be better off without him. Well, I don't know if that's true or not. I do know that in the summers, Dill comes and stays with his Aunt Rachel. And once he meets Jim and Scout, they become fast friends. So Dill, I want to talk about foil characters. Now, this is typically something we study when we read Romeo and Juliet, and sadly, we're not going to do that. So I'm going to talk about foil characters. Foil characters in literature are characters who are so different that the qualities of one character emphasize or highlight the opposing qualities of the other character. So while Jim and Scout and Dill have many shared similar qualities, there are differences. And I think Dill is introduced to provide us with that perspective. So Dill comes, and Dill is fascinated by the Radley place. As I turn to page 10, the Radley place fascinated Dill. In spite of our warnings and our explanation, it drew him as the moon draws water. Dill wants answers. And if you have younger brothers and sisters, as I've asked earlier, you know that they are curious creatures and they want answers to their questions. The Radley place is described at the middle of page 10. And every time I read this paragraph, I think of Miss Lottie. Do you remember Miss Lottie and Marigolds? Marigolds, in Marigolds by Eugenia Collier, Miss Lottie's home was described as the most ramshackle of all the houses in Lisbeth's community. That story, Marigolds, which we read, was also set during the Depression. And the description of Miss Lottie's home and the description of the Radley place are very reminiscent of one another. Inside the house lived a malevolent phantom. Malevolent meaning evil or dangerous, phantom, ghost. So some presence lived there. People said he existed, but Jim and I had never seen him. Imagine someone in your neighborhood that you've been told lives in a particular house, but someone you've never laid eyes on. Wouldn't you be curious? Sure you would. I would. At the bottom of the page, we get some fake news about Boo Radley. It suggests that any small crime that happened, he did it. At one time, the community was being terrorized and chickens and pets were being mutilated. Boo was blamed. Now, ultimately, Crazy Addie, who's never mentioned again, but Crazy Addie was responsible for these crimes. But people still blame Boo. And I'm wondering why. At the top of page 11, we see the word Negro. Now, Negro was a word for a Black person, and at that time, that was a respectful, appropriate way to refer to a Black person. That a Negro would not even walk past the Radley place. They would cross the walk. If it were nighttime, they would cross to the other side of the road. Pecans that fell from the Radley pecan tree could kill you. They were poisonous. Don't eat those. The schoolyard, which backed up to the Radley property, the schoolyard playground, if someone hit a ball into the Radley yard, it was gone. They never attempted to get that ball back. In the middle of page 11, a curious line. The misery of that house began many years before Jim and I were born. The misery of that house. What on earth could that have been? Talks about the Radley place always being shut up. And that was unusual in Macon because people would often visit, especially on Sundays. They would visit neighbors and doors would be open to welcome guests. But here's why Boo Radley becomes such an obsession and a fixation to many in Macon. on page 12, and I'm going to read some of this. According to neighborhood legend, when the younger Radley boy, this is Arthur, when he was in his teens, he became acquainted or started hanging out with the Cunningham boys from Old Sarum. Now, I want you to remember this, the Cunninghams from Old Sarum. You're going to meet Mr. Cunningham, one of the Cunninghams. You're going to meet him later, and we're going to draw some inferences about what kind of man he is. But at this time, when Arthur Radley was a young boy, he became acquainted with these Cunninghams. They started hanging out. They were his friends. And boy, was this a bad group of boys. Here's some of the things they were guilty of. They hung around the barber shop. There's some bad news for you. They rode the bus to Abbotsville on Sunday and went to the picture show. Movies on a Sunday? Outrageous. Said they also attended dances at the county's Riverside gambling hell. Oh my word, gambling, dancing. They experimented with stump hole whiskey. So they were making whiskey and drinking it. Now, I'm not going to suggest that those are good activities or bad activities, but don't you imagine teenagers often experiment with taboo activities? Drinking alcohol is something that teenagers often experiment with. We know it's wrong, but I don't know that it makes these teens monstrous. Said one night in an excessive spurt of high spirits, the boys locked Macomb's constable in an outhouse. An outhouse is like an outdoor bathroom facility. They lock him in there. He's not hurt, perhaps a little embarrassed, but he's fine. But charges are pressed against the boys. The boys, according to the judge, would be sent to a state industrial school. So their punishment, Arthur Radley and some of these Cunninghams, their punishment was they were going to be sent off. And it describes this school as a place where sometimes kids just went when they weren't being cared for by their parents. It was no prison, and it was no disgrace, but Mr. Radley felt that it was. Mr. Radley convinced the judge to let Boo come home. Mr. Radley assured the judge that he would take care of Boo Radley. And sadly, he does. Knowing that Mr. Radley's word was his bond, the judge was glad to do so. Says the other boys did wind up attending the industrial school and received a fabulous secondary or high school education. The doors of the Radley house were closed on weekdays now, as well as Sundays. And Mr. Radley's boy was not seen again for 15 years. 15 years, Boo is a prisoner in his own home. Now, as we're experiencing this safe at home recommendation by our state governor, some of you are getting a little stir crazy, and we've just been home barely a couple of weeks. 15 years, Boo is a prisoner in his home. Further along on page 13, we're told that later an incident occurs, and according to Miss Stephanie, now is she a reliable source or is she spreading fake news? I don't know. But according to Miss Stephanie, Boo was sitting at the living room cutting items from the local newspaper to paste into a scrapbook. And imagine, what would you do? I mean, no television, no internet, no streaming devices, no Sirius radio. Imagine how isolated Boo Radley must have been. So here we have a young man older than yourselves, and here we find him cutting pictures from the newspaper for a scrapbook. It said, as his father entered the room, Mr. Radley passed Boo and Boo drove scissors into his father's leg, pulled them out, wiped them on his pants, and resumed his activities. Now, this is Miss Stephanie's version of the events. It said that at this point, Miss Radley ran screaming from the house that Boo was trying to kill them. But there was really no evidence of that. The sheriff shows up and Boo is sitting there, continuing his cutting and pasting. Boo, we're told, was 33 years old. So at 18 years of age, Boo makes a foolish mistake. And the consequence, the repercussions for his actions, 15 years isolated in his home. As the story continues, we finally learn that Boo is held there, out of sight. Jim suggested that maybe his father kept him chained to a bed, but Atticus says no, that there are other ways of making people into ghosts. Eventually, Boo's father passes away. Boo's father, Boo's mother, they die. But rather than that being the end of Boo's incarceration, Boo's older brother comes from Florida, returns from Pensacola, and takes up where his father had left off. And Boo remains a prisoner in his home. Dill, over on page 16, is so fascinated, is so curious. Wonder what he looks like, Dill asked. So Jim gave a reasonable description of Boo. Boo was about 6.5 feet tall, judging from his tracks. He dined on raw squirrels and any cats he could catch. And his hands were bloodstained because once you eat a raw animal, you can never wash the blood out. There was a long, jagged scar that ran across his face. His teeth, what few he had, were yellow and rotten. His eyes popped out of his head, and he drooled most of the time. Now, Jim describes Boo in great detail, but he's never seen Boo, so where's his source? Dill begins shaming Jim into going up and touching the door of the Radley house. And he is relentless. Time and time again, he suggests that Jim is scared. He calls people of Macomb cowards. Where Dill is from, people are much braver. But Jim, he says, is a coward. He is afraid. You are still scared, he says in the middle of page 17. Jim wants to do this, but I think Jim really is scared. Jim ultimately cannot resist the dare that Dill is placing before him. All that I have to do, touch the house, that is all. Middle of page 18, Dill nodded. Are you sure that's all now? I don't want you hollering something different the minute I come back. So Jim is really actually considering going through with this. Jim walked to the corner of the lot and then back again, studying the simple terrain, trying to decide how best to effect an entry. Jim threw open the gate and sped to the side of the house, slapped it with his palm, and ran back past us, not waiting to see if his foray, if his adventure, if his attack on the house was successful. Dill and I followed on his heels. When we were safely on the porch, panting and out of breath, we looked back. The old house was the same, droopy and sick, but as we stared down the street, we thought we saw an inside shutter move. Flick. Flick. A tiny, almost invisible movement, and the house was still. Important points to keep in mind as we read Mockingbird. Boo Radley is so critical. He is in our opening chapter, and you meet him again as the novel ends in your book, chapter 31, which ends on page 376. Boo Radley is so important. As you're reading, any mention of Boo needs to be read with care and thoughtful consideration. Chapter 1 is a little tough. I promise there's going to be more action as the story progresses. And when we get to part 2, after you finish the first 11 chapters, which you will, as you finish those first 11 chapters and we move into part 2, the action is just going to escalate. The conflict is going to become just in your face. And so I'm hoping that these chapter discussions are going to be beneficial to you. That's going to be it for now, and I'll see you with chapter 2 later.